Hello, this is Daniel Estrada. This is February 14th. We're in the Lesson 5 weekly Hangout. Remember, these Hangouts are for asking questions and having some open discussion about the lesson material. So we're on Lesson 5 right now. Let's go ahead and jump into the course. Yeah, here we go. So we're on Lesson 5. The lecture is already up online. Lesson 5 is about whistleblowing, is about the ethics of whistleblowing, when it's appropriate or when it's inappropriate. There's a couple of different people that we have this week talking about whistleblowing. We have Richard George and Douglas Birch, who have sort of conflicting views about whistleblowing. So in some cases they agree, and in other cases they have conflicts. So the lecture, I talk about their various views. This week we also introduce deontology, which is the second of our big ethical theories. Deontology is about our duties and obligations as opposed to merely the consequences of our actions. Sometimes ethics might require us to follow through on an obligation even when it results in worse consequences, maybe for others, maybe for yourself. So deontologists are about ethics related to duties, related to obligations, related to permission. And that's different from the ethics of consequences. So I talk about this a little bit in the lesson, in the lecture. I spent most of my time talking about the whistleblowing cases. We can talk about that a little bit today. What I wanted to start with today is going back to Lesson 4. You just finished your Lesson 4 essay last week. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Nuremberg defense and a little bit about Hannah Arendt and her view of Adolf Eichmann. So I wanted to start with this discussion from last week. You have your replies due tonight, and then move on to Lesson 5. Let me stop here before I go any further and see if there's any questions from the class, from the people who showed up. If anyone has questions about the assignments or the assignment structure. I should apologize to people with the attendance quizzes for the lectures. This has not been going very smoothly. Last semester, just to explain what's going on, last semester I had students fill out a different form on a separate website for attendance credit for the week. And that went okay, except it was a big deal to try to get the attendance put up on Moodle. I'm trying to do it this semester with the assignments on Moodle. Part of the problem is that sometimes students take the quizzes before I've totally set them up. So the quiz for today is going to use a secret word from this lecture, or from this Hangout session that I haven't said yet. I might as well say it now. Actually, let me make sure that I know the right question, the right word. Yeah, so the Hangout for today, I'll go ahead and say it right now, is Nuremberg. Let me share the screen again. The Hangout secret word for today, for today's Hangout, is Nuremberg. That's Nuremberg as in the Nuremberg defense, as in the Nuremberg defense. Nuremberg defense, also called superior orders defense, is the legal defense that when someone is brought up on charges for a crime, that they were only following orders. It's sometimes called the Nuremberg defense, sometimes called the superior orders defense. Right, the idea is that it's not my fault because I was only following someone's orders. An order is an order. And so I can't be held responsible for what happened because I was just doing what someone else told me to do. So Nuremberg is the secret word for this lesson. So yeah, so I'll go ahead and start with the Nuremberg defense and jump into some of the things I wanted to talk about today. If you have questions or thoughts, if you'd like to interrupt me, please do interrupt me. Even if you don't want to come on video or voice chat, even just leaving a question in the group chat can help a lot. I don't like talking so much, especially in these Hangouts. So if you can add your voice, I would appreciate it. So the secret word for this today is Nuremberg. It goes back to the Nuremberg defense. Nuremberg defense, a superior orders defense, that I was only following orders. It's partly called the Nuremberg defense because it was used quite a lot during the Nuremberg trials, 1945, 1946, where a lot of the ranking Nazi officers after defeated Nazi Germany were brought to trial. A lot of the Nazis at the time said that they shouldn't be held responsible because they were just following orders. At the time, Nuremberg defense was decided to be ineffective, unconvincing. And the idea is that it's no longer enough to escape punishment. It may be enough to lessen the punishment. Maybe you're not as responsible as the person issuing the orders. But just because someone else issued orders doesn't mean that you're off the hook. This is the case for the Nuremberg trials. This ends up being the sort of standard for other legal trials, including in the US. That superior orders is not considered a justifiable defense. The place that this was most clearly tried in the US was with the My Lai massacre. Go down to the My Lai massacre. My Lai massacre, this is during the Vietnam War, 1968. Between 350 and 500 unarmed civilians in South Vietnam, including women and children, were slaughtered by a US military division. They sort of dropped into this place. They thought that there might be enemy combatants in the area, and so they were ordered to take all the villagers out of this village and shoot them in the streets. Hundreds of people died. And it was a big scandal. The My Lai massacre, once it came to light, it became one of the driving forces of the anti-war movement. It's one of the reasons why we eventually pulled out, why public sentiment turned entirely against the war, and we eventually end up pulling out and losing. And it was partly because all these soldiers ended up following their orders. So all these soldiers shoot these innocent people, women and children, and then another soldier, a helicopter pilot, figures out what's going on and alerts the command of what's going on, and they eventually stop it. He ends up getting the Soldier's Medal, which is the highest medal that a non-combatant, that a soldier not involved in active combat can receive. So afterwards, all the soldiers end up being put on trial, and only one is actually convicted. The rest are dismissed in various ways. You can read up the details of the case. It's very interesting. A bit of U.S. history. So only one person was convicted. 26 men were charged. They were all brought up for trials, but none of them were actually convicted. Some of them were court-martialed, but found not guilty. The fact that a lot of these soldiers were found not guilty, even after giving the Nuremberg defense, suggests that the U.S. doesn't have a strong ability to uphold the Nuremberg defense. It doesn't actually keep to this kind of policy. But it is the official policy, and doing these kinds of things. So a soldier, so the U.S. the policy in the military, and if you've served in the military, you might help clarify this. But the official policy is that you're supposed to follow your commanding officer, unless you know that those orders from your commanding officer are illegal or otherwise against procedure, against the law, against ethics. And if you know with confidence that your superior officer is giving you illegal or unethical orders, then the official policy is that you have the obligation to ignore your superior officer and not follow through on that illegal act. But of course, this is very difficult, especially if you're in the heat of combat, right? If you're overseas in a war, then maybe you follow your superior officer even when you're not entirely comfortable with what they're doing, right? If your superior officer tells you to shoot a village of unarmed women and children, maybe you do it because of the circumstances. And the question here is how guilty should they be considered when they were just following orders? Again, if anyone in chat or in the Hangout wants to weigh in with their view, I'd really like to hear your view. But the relationship I draw in the reading is in particular with the Eichmann trials. So Adolf Eichmann, there he is. Adolf Eichmann was a officer in the Nazi Party. He was fairly high-ranking, but he wasn't the Supreme Commander, right? He wasn't Adolf Hitler. He was sort of the middle management. He was a bureaucrat. Right? He was a paper pusher. He had a desk job. But part of what his desk job involved was the planning and execution of the extermination camps, right, where the Holocaust that resulted in millions of people dying, millions of Jews dying, and other peoples, Roma and homosexuals. Lots of people died. And Eichmann was working from a desk, but he helped plan out and design the architecture of the Holocaust. As far as I know, he didn't kill anyone by his own hands, but he was involved in the planning of lots of people dying, millions of people dying. So Eichmann was involved in the Holocaust, and then after the war, he's sent to Israel, where he's given a trial in Jerusalem. Now, Israel is obviously not going to be the most sympathetic of courts to Eichmann, and right, no one's expecting him to get let off easily as a result of this trial. In some ways, it's a show trial to as an outlet for the tragedies and the horrors of the war. But during the trial, Eichmann gives exactly the Nuremberg defense. He says, "Look, it wasn't my plan to kill all these people. It was the plan of Hitler and the people above me. It was my superiors who were telling me to do this plan, and it was my job just to do my job well, right? So this is the goal they gave me, right? This is the project they gave me, and it was my job to do that as best I could, right? So I made the plans, I executed the plans as was my job, right? That was the script that was given to me, and I followed that script." And in fact, Eichmann says that he thought that his obligation was to follow his orders, right? That's what his moral obligation was, right? He had made an oath of loyalty, right? And so he thought that he had no choice, right? That ethics required that he follow through with his oath. That if he were to go against what his superiors commanded him to do, that itself would be a kind of failure of ethics. So he thought that the matter was out of his hands, and he felt he wasn't guilty for what resulted. He says he felt guilty for arranging the transports, but not guilty for the consequences. From the chat, so Smith says, so a person following orders is in a mess from both sides. If she does not follow the orders, then they would be punished. And if they follow the orders, then they would be punished. Seems like a trolley problem. I think that's exactly right. It's one of these damned if you do, damned if you don't. Especially in a war environment. I mean, first of all, tensions are already going to be high. Anxiety is already going to be high. Right? War is a very stressful environment. But second of all, if you don't follow the orders of your commander, that might be taken as treason, right? They might shoot you on the spot for not following orders, right? So you have a gun to your head in some sense, right? And do you, when that gun is to your head, do you shoot the innocent villagers, right? Or I mean, what do you do? Again, I want to emphasize that I don't think there are right or wrong answers to these questions. I think they're very, very difficult questions to answer, and answering them is going to depend on a lot of features about the context that you can't give in any sort of general sense. So, I mean, Eichmann was a bad guy. Eichmann was not a good guy, but that doesn't mean that it would have been easy to make a different decision from Eichmann. This is Hannah Arendt's point. So Eichmann goes on trial in Jerusalem. The New Yorker magazine sends Hannah Arendt to Jerusalem to cover this trial. Let me find a better picture of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is a 20th century philosopher. She was born. Went to the same page. She was born in Germany. She's Jewish, and she escaped Germany before the war started. And then, as a result, she goes to New York. She ends up getting a job as a professor at Columbia, as a philosophy professor. And she writes a bunch of books, including one of the more famous books is this book on the origins of totalitarianism, where she explains and analyzes how the Nazis come to power, how difficult it was to stop them from coming to power, what it was like living in Germany as they came to power. This is a great book, and by the way, this book has been selling out of bookstores over the last few weeks after Trump came to power. So Hannah Arendt has been in the news quite a lot recently. But anyway, so she goes to Jerusalem to cover the Eichmann trial for the New Yorker, and she writes this book. She calls it Eichmann in Jerusalem: A Report on the Banality of Evil. A report on the banality of evil. She says the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that there were so many like him. That there were so many that were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terrible and terrifyingly normal. Right? Hannah Arendt's point here is that Eichmann did a bunch of bad things. Eichmann was a bad guy, but from Eichmann's perspective, he was just doing a desk job. And there's lots of us who just do desk jobs and who follow through with really terrible orders, follow through on really terrible projects because we're not willing to question the scripts that are given to us. Right. So Hannah Arendt's point here is, I mean, Eichmann did a terrible thing, but Eichmann, in some sense, is just like any of the rest of us, in the sense that if we were put in the same position as he, maybe we would have made those same decisions. Right. This is what she means by the banality of evil. Not that evil is not scarier, that it's not evil, but that it's the kind of thing that is more common than we like to admit. It's more normal than we like to admit. Right, so we have, let me go over here. Yeah, so this is from the lesson 4 Prezi. Right, we have this vision of evil as being this sort of comic book character evil, dastardly plans being made in like a dark tower or whatever, you're Sauron or whatever in a fantasy tale. And Hannah Arendt's point is, look, evil is not just the product of these wickedly evil men. Evil is what happens when normal people end up in situations where they can sort of do evil things without thinking about it. Right, so the guy in the desk job in a cubicle, who's maybe denying a bunch of people healthcare, right? Forcing a lot of legal immigrants into detention centers. Right? These are the kinds of things that can be done with the stroke of a pen. Right? These are the things that can be carried out by people working desk jobs who don't really think about the implications it has for human life. Right? And Hannah Arendt, this is the point she wants to make, is that we're all capable of the same kind of evil, and it happens when we stop thinking about what we're doing. So this is what happens with Eichmann. So this is a sort of long quote. I want to read a little bit of this. So there's Hannah Arendt. There's Eichmann. So she says, when I speak of the banality of evil, I do so only on a strictly factual level, pointing to phenomena which started on the face, which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not Iago, and he was not Macbeth. Right, these are both villains in Shakespeare plays. And nothing would have been further from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Except for extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal achievement, his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. This is one important thing. Eichmann, he wasn't the top-ranking person in the military, but he was fairly high-ranking. And part of the reason he became high-ranking is by following orders, right? He did his job well, or he did what his superiors asked of him. And the lesson here is that when you're in the system, right? I mean, the Nazis are scary for the Jews, but when you're another Nazi, then you might have the most advantage for your career, for your personal well-being, by doing what the other Nazis tell you to do, right? And so he was getting positive feedback from his behavior. He was getting, promotions and advancements. He was doing what all his peers and all his superiors were telling him was a good job. Right? That's positive feedback. It is encouraging him to do it more. Right? So, him looking out for his own advancement means that he ends up in this institution where he's committing these terrible atrocities. Right? And Hannah Arendt says, and in his diligence itself was in no way criminal. He certainly would have never murdered his superior in order to inherit his post. Right? So he wasn't killing people wantonly. He was killing people with the stroke of a pen who were very far away from him, and he just wasn't thinking about it. Hannah Arendt says, to put the matter colloquial, he never realized what he was doing. He was not stupid, it was sheer thoughtlessness, something that is by no means identical with stupidity. Right? Hannah Arendt calls Eichmann a clown, who's just sort of following orders, not thinking about what he's doing, just sort of following what people tell him to do. And you might think, well, look, if he's not thinking about what he's doing, if he's not really questioning his commands, then maybe he's not really responsible for what happens as a result. But then at the same time, you might think, but look, if he did think about it, then he could have stopped, maybe he could have stopped these things from happening. Or maybe he could have at least not contributed to the problem. But instead of actively resisting, he does the opposite, right? He actively contributes. He helps this project go through. He actively assists in the killing of millions and millions of people. Okay, so people are talking about the secret word in chat. It looks like Amaka agrees with Smith that there's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't trolley problem aspect to the case. Again, the point here is not to say, is not to tell you what to do. It's not to tell you that you should always ignore your superiors. I do want to make sure that you realize that you can ignore your superiors, that you're under no obligation, either legally or ethically, to follow them if they tell you to do something that's illegal or unethical. If your superiors are telling you to do something that you know is wrong, that you know is illegal or unethical or makes things unsafe, then you have every right in the world to ignore their command. Now, that it might not turn out well for you. You might get punished, right? We saw in the lecture, Ernest Fitzgerald, C5A, he was removed from his job. He was assigned to bogus jobs. And it took him years of legal battles in order for him to get reinstated in his position. Right? But he thought that he had an obligation to tell the truth when he was testifying before the Senate. Following through on that obligation, weighing the different obligations you have against each other and figuring out which obligations to follow through on, those are difficult problems. Those are problems that don't have any clear solutions. They certainly don't have any a priori solutions that I can give you now that will tell you exactly what to do in the future. But part of the challenge is for you to think for yourself about how to make these decisions, right? Where your own ethics lie, right? And what you're willing to do, willing to tolerate. But what that requires is that you actually think. It requires that you don't just pass it off to your script and sort of do whatever you're doing. It requires that you actually think about what you're doing. And getting people to think is not very easy. easy done. You can lead a horse to water. Does anyone have any comments or questions? I've been chatting for a while. Some heavy stuff, controversial stuff. I don't know if this will help conversation go, but we can, if we go to the news, Michael Flynn just resigned from the Trump's cabinet. Let me see if I can find it. So Michael Flynn was the national security advisor, and he resigned a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday. And he resigned partly because he had failed to let Trump know about meetings he had had with Russia just before the election. Go away. Yeah, so Flynn was having meetings with the Russian ambassador right before Trump's inauguration. And when those came to light, Trump fired his national security advisor. Now, here's the thing. Trump knew about this a couple of weeks ago, actually. The then Attorney General Sally Yates had told Trump that Flynn had been talking to Russians and hadn't been totally honest about his association with the Russians. So the Attorney General had told Trump that this might have been an issue, and the Attorney General was fired by Trump, partly because she had said that she would not obey his orders if they were against her own understanding of the law, against the understanding of ethics, right? So Trump had chosen Michael Flynn for the national security advisor himself. It was part of his administration. So when Yates had raised questions about Flynn, right, this went against Trump, and so Trump fired Yates. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where Yates even had this meeting before Congress, before the Senate, saying that she would disobey orders if she knew them to be illegal or unethical. And then she was fired. And then a couple of days later, we find out that the suggestions that she was making about Trump's cabinet were in fact true, and that he has to resign over this. The point here generally is that right now we're witnessing in the headlines on a daily basis lots of people in government deciding for themselves whether they feel comfortable going along with Trump's administration, with his agenda, with the policies that he's been putting forward, or people who are not comfortable with it and want to get out soon. I'll just mention again that this is exactly what happens in Nazi Germany after the Nazis take power. Right, you have this big shakeup where everyone, even slightly concerned about the Nazis, ends up leaving Germany entirely, right, going to the U.S. or England. By the way, part of the reason that the U.S. has such science superiority after the war is because we took all the good German scientists who didn't want to be part of the Nazi regime. Right, and then so you shake out all the people who are critics, and you stock the place full of people who are loyal supporters. We're seeing this happen right now, and we're seeing lots of government officials who aren't okay with what's happening and are either resigning themselves or being forced out of the system. I mentioned, I think last week, all the rogue Twitter accounts. Yeah. Trump is on Twitter all over the place, but he's told all of his agencies that they're not allowed to tweet without approval from the White House. And so because they're not allowed to tweet on their official Twitter streams, all these departments, all these agencies have set up these rogue Twitter services: Alt National Park Service, Alt Customs, Alt White House Senior Advisor. right? And these are people who work for the National Park Service, but they're not allowed to tweet on the normal Twitter channels, and so they're tweeting on these alt channels. This is it's a kind of civil disobedience. It's a kind of active resistance. It's obviously not going to be enough to start a revolution, but it's some kind of resistance. Right? These are the employees of these agencies trying to speak out while still holding their jobs. Now, these are all military situations, because this is where you see the just following orders where the ethics of this are the strongest, and the debates are sort of the hardest to work through. But the superior orders defense is something that we see all over the place, and the, oops, let me go back to Dennis Joya. Right, Dennis Joya's explanation in his article where he's talking about Pinto fires and personal ethics, where he explains the decisions that he makes, right? His explanation was that he was following the script. This is just the Nuremberg defense. This is just, I was following orders. And so the question is that the right justification? Is that sufficient justification for getting him out of responsibility? A lot of people in the forums were saying, well, look, if he's just following orders, if that's what his boss told him to do, you can't really hold him responsible for the actions. Right? It's his boss's fault for giving him bad orders. But I mean, maybe this isn't so clear. Maybe Dennis Joya does deserve more of the responsibility. I mean, after all, he had his own ethical misgivings about what they were doing, and he could have acted on them, right? He could have refused to vote unanimously to not issue the recall. He could have voted for a recall. It might have gotten him fired from the job, or it might have changed the culture in Ford, right? But he doesn't know because he didn't do it. Thoughts from the chat? Could you all blow the whistle? If you were in Dennis Joya's position, could you have blown the whistle? Yeah, come in. Thank you. Thank you. Right. What would you have done in Joya's situation? Should he have done more? Anyone want to save me from a silent video? Good. So someone in chat, Neha in chat says, if I was in his position, I would have spoken up. He had values going into his position at Ford, and so he should have maintained them while he was working there. Axel says he should have forwarded the recall of the Pintos. So Neha makes a good point that he had these values going into Ford, and part of what happens when he joins the corporation is that his own values change. It's not that he's able to change Ford from the inside. I mean, he goes into Ford thinking that he can change it from the inside, that he can be a voice for moral thinking and have more of an influence working for the company than working outside of it. But what actually happens is that he ends up just adopting the values of the company and changing his own views. Right. So this is one of the biggest challenges of engineering ethics. Almost everyone comes into this class thinking, I know the difference between right and wrong. I know what it means to be moral. Right. My parents taught me well. And the challenge here is not, do you know the difference between right and wrong? The challenge is, can you maintain that challenge? Can you maintain your own views in the face of this overwhelming pressure from your corporate environment, from your bosses, from your peers? Right? This is the kind of this is much more than just peer pressure, high school pressure that you experience in high school. Right? This is for your job, where your career is on the line. Making these kinds of decisions, it's not easy, and it's especially not easy if we don't appreciate how easy it is for our own values to be corrupted. Right, so this is part of the point of going through all the psychological studies, the Ash conformity experiment, the Milgram obedience experiment, is even if you have very strong morals, even if you have a very strong attitude about what's right and wrong, it's very easy to find yourself in a situation where those attitudes can be undermined quite easily by your superiors, right? They can, it doesn't take much. It doesn't even take them pointing a gun in your head. It just takes the right kind of urging. Right? Someone compels you to do it in the right sort of way, and you'll end up doing it. By the way, Milgram did his experiments, the shock test experiment. He did these experiments in the 1960s, partly in response to the Hannah Arendt discussion of the banality of evil. Right. So Hannah Arendt says any one of us could have been Eichmann if we found ourselves in the same position. Any one of us might have done the same thing. Even if you know it's wrong to murder millions of people, you still might have succumbed to the pressure of doing it anyway. And so Milgram's a psychologist. He's an experimental psychologist. He wants to see if this is actually true. Is it actually true that people will follow orders to do these evil actions? So he designs the Milgram experiment, the shock experiment. He designs it explicitly to test whether the average person can commit these violent acts against people. When Milgram started the experiment, he hypothesized that something like 3%, like less than 1%. Less than 10%, but probably closer to 3%, or it might have even said 0.3%. Some very small fraction of people would actually follow through with the most extreme shocks. And Milgram thought that most people would stop once they hear the other person complaining. Once they hear screaming in the other room, they're not going to go on. I mean, we're not forcing them to hurt another person. We're just asking them to do it. And people aren't going to want to hurt people if they don't have to. And Milgram was totally wrong, right? Turns out that 65% of the people are willing to follow through with these actions, right? More than half. Clear majority of people are willing to follow through with orders that even they know is wrong, orders that even they don't want to follow, but that they're willing to follow through with these orders anyway because they're being told by a superior officer. By a superior at all, by their boss. Yeah, so Axel says, he says he agrees that anyone can say right now that they would do what they would do, but I think it's very different when you're actually in that position, since you'll most likely have more to consider. And he relates to the Challenger case, which is a good connection. I don't know if Axel can say more about the relationship to the Challenger case. But I think he's definitely right that saying that it would be the wrong decision now in a classroom like this, it's very easy, especially when we're all sort of thinking about ethics explicitly. But when you're actually in that situation, it's a lot harder to make that decision. There's a lot more things to consider. It's a lot more difficult to see what the ethically correct thing to do is. So one more time, the point of this class is not to tell you that you should always do the right thing, because it's not often clear what the right thing to do is. The point here is to get you to think about what you think the right thing is, get you to think about the standards by which you're going to judge these cases, right? Get you to have some preparation so that when you're faced with an ethical challenge, right, when you're faced with the trolley problem, that you at least have your wits about you to know why the decision matters, why it matters that you think about your decision carefully. Any other thoughts from class? Yeah, okay, so Axel's elaborates here on the relationship to the Challenger explosion. He says, as we read in the post about the Challenger case, the head manager told the head engineer to put on his management hat. He told him to forget about his beliefs and worry about the important things like the company's reputation, the fact that it already had multiple postponements. Right, this is right. I mean, and this is part of how management works. This is part of how the corporate environment works. Is that part of the goal of the corporation, part of the goal of your boss, is to get you to focus on what your job is, where that job is some vital thing for the overall company. So the company doesn't want you to think about anything other than getting that job done. And in some sense, it's your responsibility to understand the difference between the orders that you're given and the right thing to do, and to be sort of weighing these things against each other. Your company also has a responsibility to do the ethical thing. Your company also has a responsibility to keep the ethical codes, to stay within the law, but also stay within the ethics of the field. So your company has an obligation to be ethical as well, but so do you. And in some sense, you might not be the last line of defense, but you're a line of defense. That if that project doesn't go through without your support, and you're in a position to refuse your support, you have good reason to refuse your support, because you think the thing is unethical, then refusing your support can change the situation. So we'll go over a couple of cases from here. So let me, in Moodle, next week, we're going to go over virtue ethics and talk about integrity. And then the week after that, we start looking at the NSP Code of Ethics, and we look at actual cases that the Board of Ethical Review looks at. And then we do the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and geoengineering. A lot of these cases, especially the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, you'll see when we go through the documents for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, you'll see that there are several places where people could have raised objections to the plan. Right? Where, in fact, they raised some questions about the plan. They could have raised objections. They could have stopped it from happening, but they didn't. Right? And it's because they didn't stop it. A bunch of engineers. One of the great things about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is that we have the emails that the engineers were sending each other as they made the decision. So you can see, you can see in real time how they're making the decision, what kinds of considerations they're making, in their own words, from their own perspective. So we'll see cases where making these decisions is difficult, and the consequences of making them or not making them. Let's see. Yeah, so Axel's here is continuing with the discussion of the Challenger explosion. He says the VP engineer knew that there were issues, and when it comes to space flight people in his position, engineers know that no problem can and should be overlooked, because any little problem can and will go bad, which unfortunately leads to disaster. Someone said that there's a problem with the secret word. Let me check this really quickly. All right, that should have fixed the grading issue. Sorry about that. Okay. If no one has any other questions or comments on the Nuremberg defense on sort of just following orders, I guess I'll just say just a little bit about DeGeorge and Birch, and then I'll wrap up. I say a lot more about this in the actual lecture. So I just wanted to sort of set you up for this discussion. DeGeorge and Birch are arguing about when whistleblowing should be obligatory And George has these 5 conditions on whistleblowing. He has 5 conditions, and if you have to meet all 5 for whistleblowing to be obligatory. In other words, you're required to whistleblow. The first 3 just make whistleblowing permissible. In other words, you shouldn't whistleblow unless you meet the first 3 conditions. If you meet the first 3 conditions, then it's okay to whistleblow, but you don't have to. And then the second 2 conditions 4 and 5 are obligations. You have an obligation to whistleblow. So if you meet conditions 4 or 5, George thinks, then you're required to whistleblow. And you have an ethical obligation to whistleblow. The first 3 conditions are just about the harm itself, that it's serious and considerable, and that you've made your concerns known to your superiors and every other channel available within the company. Remember, whistleblowing is about reporting some potential harm to sources outside of the normal operational channels. So if you find a problem and you let your boss know, well, and that's who you should let know. So that's not whistleblowing. If you let his boss know, if there's some other procedures in your company for letting these problems be known, right? Following all those procedures, in general, it should be your first line of defense. And George thinks that you have to do those things first before whistleblowing is even permissible. When you find out something, you shouldn't just go tell the newspapers. You should first at least find out that the company knows about it. You have obligations to your company first. But if those obligations fall through, if you've exhausted all the available channels and still nothing's being done about the harm, then George thinks that it's okay to whistleblow, but you don't have to. George's big issue here is about treating engineers as moral heroes. So George worries that all these discussions about engineering ethics in the Challenger case and the Pinto case and so on, that these make engineers out to be, that we require them to be heroes, that we require engineers to always be morally perfect, right? Because it's the engineers who have to know that the managers are doing something wrong. So the engineers have to be the ones that are strong enough to step forward and stop this bad project from going through. And George thinks, well, look, I mean, if an engineer can do this thing, if an engineer can stop some tragedy from occurring, that's a great thing. I mean, and everyone would appreciate it. But they're not required to do that. It's not part of their job description to be moral heroes. And if we require that all the engineers be moral heroes, and I mean, that's an unreasonable requirement for the job description. The requirement for the engineers should be that they do their job, they do it well, that they take care of any ethical situations that they're aware of, but they don't have to sacrifice their own well-being for these things, right? They don't have to go above and beyond what their job demands of them. So George thinks that the conditions on whistleblowing should be fairly high. It should be relatively rare that an engineer is in a position to whistleblow. In particular, George thinks you need these 2 additional conditions met. That you have documented evidence that would prove to an impartial observer that you are right and your company is wrong. And then you have strong evidence that going public with this information will prevent the harm from happening. Right, so not only do you need to know that the harm is serious and considerable and that you've exhausted all internal channels within the company, but you also have to be convinced that making this information known publicly will do something to prevent that harm from occurring. So, like, say Dennis Joya knew that the Pintos were exploding on the roads, but then he thought, well, look, if I cause a problem, then maybe we call a few meetings, but none of the managers are going to agree to recalling the Pinto. The CEO certainly does not want to recall the Pinto. So even if I make this information known, no one's going to do anything about it. On George's view, if that's what you decided, if you think that no one's going to do anything about it, even if you make the information public, then on George's view, then you don't have any obligation to make that information public. Your only obligation is to prevent the harm, George thinks. And if making this information public won't prevent the harm, then there's no reason to put your career on the line in order to do it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So about the strong evidence that going public will prevent the harm. When he's saying harm, is he specifically referring to like immediate repercussions as a result of him going public, or is it also referring to things that would happen down the line?
So I think DeGeorge is thinking about, like in the case of the Pinto exploding, right? The harm is that the Pintos explode, and so preventing the harm means preventing the Pintos from exploding. That might be installing the new part. That might be issuing some other kind of recall. But something that will get those Pintos from stopping exploding. Now that might take a long time, right? It might be that you issued the recall, and there's a big long process for it, and it takes 18 months before all the Pintos are fixed. But that still gets the problem addressed. It might take a long time for it to do it, but it still gets the problem addressed. What DeGeorge is worried about here is making the information public and nothing happening from it, right? So if you tell a bunch of people, hey, these cars are exploding, and no one does anything, there's no lawsuits, there's no criminal investigation, there's no recall. If nothing ends up happening from it, DeGeorge says, well, look, all you've really done is put your career on the line by making it clear that you're gonna reveal company secrets. That's not good for you. And to think and what DeGeorge wants to say is that you shouldn't be obligated to put your career in danger if you don't know that it's actually going to prevent the harm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So as long as there's more public good, then it's justifiable to go public.
Yeah, and in fact, that's really helpful to think about it in consequentialist terms, right? DeGeorge wants to say that if the consequences end up better off because you went public, then you should whistleblow. But if they don't, then you don't know. So here's the problem with DeGeorge's second two requirements. I think most people agree with these first three requirements, that you have an obligation to your company to go through with the procedures that the company has. There are exceptions to that, and I talk about some of these exceptions with the Edward Snowden case in the lecture. But most people are okay with the first three conditions. It's the second two conditions that are difficult to meet. And this is Douglas Birch's response to DeGeorge. Birch says, look, if the requirement for whistleblowing to be obligatory is that you need to know that it's actually going to prevent the harm, then Birch says, in that case, most engineers will not be in a position to ever whistleblow, because how will an engineer actually know that it'll prevent the harm? Right? If I'm releasing this information to a journalist, say, so they can post a newspaper, I don't know that that article is going to be effective. Right? I don't know that anyone's going to listen to it. They might, but they might not. And as an engineer, I don't often know in advance what's going to happen. So that's for number 5. For number 4 also, the engineer might not know what would convince an impartial observer. Part of the reason that the engineer has a special obligation here is because the engineer has expert knowledge about the technical details, and that's expert knowledge that an impartial observer might not have. So it might be that the engineer is uniquely in a position to understand why this thing is wrong, right? Is uniquely in a position to explain why there's a great harm. And maybe most other people who don't have engineering experience or engineering expertise won't understand what harm you're explaining. But that shouldn't stop the engineer from making this information public. In some sense, the engineer has an obligation to find someone who will understand, and that person might not be impartial in the right sort of way. So the point here is that Birch thinks that these two criteria are just too strict, so that no one's ever going to meet these criteria. Or it's going to be very rare in a real case that someone's going to have this kind of information in advance. So if you're going by DeGeorge's criteria, then most engineers are never going to be in a position where they feel obligated to whistleblow. And what Birch wants to say is, but that's too strict. I mean, not that engineers need to be moral heroes, but just that they have some obligation to go on their own ethical sense and not to hold it to these much higher standards. Right? What Birch wants to say is, look, if you think that there's some harm, and you don't know of any other way to address this harm except by going public, then you should go public, and you shouldn't hold it to any higher standards than that. If you think that there's a harm, and you have no other way of addressing that harm, then go public with the harm. So I don't want to decide for you whether DeGeorge or Birch is right. I give both articles in the lecture. DeGeorge's article is fairly famous in the engineering ethics literature, and Birch's response is also fairly well known. Both DeGeorge and Birch are talking specifically about the Pinto case. So if you read their articles, The examples that they're using are the Pinto case examples that we're all familiar with already. So the goal here isn't for me to tell you which one's right and which one's wrong, but for you to sort of start exploring it on your own. Any questions?
Yeah, just another thing about DeGeorge's conditions. So do you think that he would consider, like, let's say the person decides to whistleblow about their company or their corporation or wherever they worked for, and as a result of it, they get arrested because of, you know, some contract that they violated or something that they did, and it caused them to get arrested, but it caused general public good. Does he think that that's a justifiable cause for him to go public? Like, is that something that he would be okay with happening?
Can you say the case one more time? Is people get arrested from going public?
Yeah, like let's say I say something like bad about the company, and then as a result of that, you know, I breach a contract. Let's say I was working for like a government contracted job, and I say something and I breach a contract, and, you know, for some reason I end up getting arrested for that. Is that okay? Like, is that justifiable? Like, from a consequentialist perspective, I guess, because, you know, you get the public good out, but is it still okay?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, it depends on what particular thing you're talking about. If you get arrested and no greater good happens from it, then maybe not. But, you know, if you end up saving lives because of what you did, right? So you breached your contract, you did something illegal, and you still end up arrested from that. Maybe that arrest is justifiable because you broke your contract. But I mean, just in terms of what the law is, right? You did something illegal. But if that being arrested saves a bunch of people from dying, then maybe the consequentialists would hold it that you did the right thing. And that's the kind of thing that maybe in a trial to see that you broke the law, that's the kind of thing that maybe gets passed off. So I mentioned this in the lecture, but let me pull up the NSPE Code of Ethics one more time. So we've looked at this a little bit. We've just read the preamble and the fundamental canons. The rest of the fundamental canons for the NSPE Code of Ethics for engineers, I'm sorry, the rest of the Code of Ethics is just basically going over each of the fundamental canons and elaborating on them. So the first canon is that we hold the safety, health, and welfare of the public paramount. And so the first rule of practice here, that engineers shall hold the safety, health, and welfare of the public, hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And then it explains what that means in a bunch of rules. I wanted to just call attention here to rules C. So the engineer should not reveal facts, data, or information without prior consent of the client or employer, except as authorized or required by law or this code. So this sort of addresses this issue of breaching a contract, right? So the rule says that you shouldn't reveal information without prior consent of a client, except when it's required by law or this code. And the code says that your fundamental responsibility is the safety, health, and welfare of the public. So the point here is that the Code of Ethics explicitly recognizes that sometimes you might have to go against the wishes of your client, even when you have a contract, even when the law requires that you obey the contract, because maybe the code requires that you do something different, right? If the ethics code requires that you act in the health and safety of the public, maybe that requires breaking your contract with the employer. Maybe that also requires going against the law. But the code says that safety is paramount, and so you would be operating within the Code of Ethics for breaking the law in order to hold this canon. And the way this works in practice is that violations of the ethics code they're assessed by, states give out engineering licenses. Licenses are given out on a state-by-state basis, and every state might have slightly different requirements for their engineering license. And the state board that gives out the engineering licenses works in conjunction with professionals, engineering societies like the NSPE, about what their Code of Ethics requires. And so if there's ever a violation of ethics, for instance, then you might have to go in front of the licensing board, and there will be people who are looking at the Code of Ethics in order to evaluate whether you've done something illegal. If the Code of Ethics, if you make clear in front of the licensing board that you're following the Code of Ethics, even against the law, it might be that you get off with no problem. And in fact, we'll look at cases like this in week 7. Our assignment in week 7 is to go through the Board of Ethical Review. So the NSPE, they have this code of ethics, but they also have decades of precedent where, so they have a Board of Ethical Review that looks at cases. The cases are sort of fictionalized cases. They're not real cases. But they look at all these cases and then they give a ruling. So let me just look at one of these, for instance. So here's an example of one of these rulings. This is case 15.5 from 2015. The way that these cases work is that they give you the specific case, who's doing what to whom. They ask certain questions about it. They talk about which codes of ethics are implicated in this situation. And then they give a big, long discussion about the ethics of the case. Who's responsible? How much are they responsible? What about these particular exceptions to this rule? Right? How do we interpret the rule? The point of this document is to give an interpretation of the ethical code. The people who write this document are engineers or people who are on the engineering board, the ethics board for engineers. And I mean, sometimes these rules are ambiguous. Sometimes they're not exactly clear. So the point of these rulings is to give these interpretations of these rules within a particular context. And we'll see lots of examples like this where someone has to breach a contract because the ethics demands that they breach that contract, right? Or an employer asks that you not alert the authorities about some toxic waste they have on their site. Well, you might have a contract with that employer to not talk about that toxic waste, but if that represents an environmental hazard, then you have an obligation to tell a regulatory agency that there's environmental waste there, and your the person who's contracting you is in violation of the law. And if you follow through with a contract that's in violation of the law, you're also in violation of the law. So you have an obligation there to break that contract and work for the health and safety of the public. And the Code of Ethics for Engineers recognizes your obligation to violate the consent of your employers, to violate even the law in order to uphold the code. So again, we'll look at specific cases like this in a couple of weeks, dealing with real engineering cases. Let me go back to the chat. Neha asked to go over whistleblowing one more time. I didn't do it very clearly. I spend more time talking about this in the actual lecture for the week. But let me just clarify one more time. Whistleblowing, a whistleblower is someone who exposes illegal or unethical or otherwise inappropriate behavior within an organization in order to take action to stop that illegal or unethical behavior. Now, importantly, the whistleblower takes action that's outside of the normal approved channels. So usually a business will have some procedure for making complaints known, a grievance procedure. Maybe you just tell your boss, maybe there's a form you fill out. If you've done all of what your company requires that you do in order to take action on these issues, and they're still not taking action on these issues, and you think that the potential harm from not doing anything is great enough, then you might want to alert other authorities. You might want to alert regulatory authorities or government agencies so that they find out about this illegal activity. You might want to alert other businesses that are maybe dealing with this company to let them know that, look, they're doing this illegal or unethical thing. Or other contractors with the company, you might want to let know. You also might just want to let the general public know. Maybe you release documents to a newspaper or a journalist outfit who can publish it in a newspaper or magazine and let the general public know about this illegal or unethical activity. And maybe things happen as a result of that media exposure, right? Like we saw with the Mark Dowie Pinto case. Those Pintos had been on the road for 7 years before Mark Dowie wrote his article. And it wasn't until his article got published that there was a big public outcry and legal response. So maybe releasing that information to a newspaper can also help. But all of these things are outside of the normal in-organization channels. So that's what whistleblowing is. In the normal lecture, I go over a couple of cases of whistleblowing. I already mentioned Ernst Fitzgerald and C5A. Ernst Fitzgerald was working for Lockheed Martin. I think it was just Lockheed at the time. And Lockheed was contracted to make these cargo planes for the US military. The cargo planes had run $2 billion over costs, and this was taxpayer money, right? So $2 billion of taxpayer money was being sunk into these airplanes, and it was way over schedule, way over budget. Fitzgerald knew this. Fitzgerald wasn't an engineer, but he knew about the details of this plane being developed. And he was called before the Senate to testify. And his bosses told him, don't say anything about the C-5A. Don't tell him anything about the cost overruns. But he had to go testify under oath to the Senate. And when he was asked about C-5A, he told the truth. He told the senators that it's $2 billion over budget. It's costing taxpayers a lot of money. Fitzgerald did this in front of the Senate. He told the truth in front of the Senate, and he ended up getting stripped of his duties, reassigned to different departments, told to work on a bunch of bogus jobs. It ended up taking 4 years before he was reinstated in his job. He received a big blow to his career because of telling the truth to the Senate in this case. But one of the benefits from his actions is that he laid the groundwork for what eventually became the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989. The Whistleblower Protection Act protects whistleblowers from legal repercussions from retaliation for blowing the whistle. You might think of it as like a witness protection program, right? If you want to testify against the mob, if you know that the mob did something illegal and you want to testify against them, well, the mob might want to take you out before you get to testify, and so you need protection. So there's a bunch of legal protections about killing witnesses. Well, it's the same thing here. So the protection here is from retaliation against a whistleblower. So currently it's illegal to retaliate against a whistleblower like this, right, where you strip them of their duties and reassign them to another department or whatever. It's illegal to retaliate against a whistleblower if the whistleblower is a government contractor or a government employee. So whistleblower protections in the United States are not very strong. The only whistleblower protections we really have are protections against protections for federal employees, whistleblowing against government agencies. So you have legal protection as a whistleblower if you're blowing the whistle against the government for doing something illegal, which is basically what Ernst Fitzgerald was doing. Ernst Fitzgerald was not a government employee; he was a Lockheed employee, but Lockheed's a government contractor, and this is money from government. It's taxpayer money from the government. So it would be illegal to retaliate against Ernst Fitzgerald for whistleblowing in this way. But if you're whistleblowing against your private company, there's not very many laws in place to protect you in these situations. Part of what Obama ran on in 2008 and again in 2012 was strengthening the Whistleblower Protection Acts and giving stronger protection to whistleblowers. And he's failed to do that pretty substantially. So there's not a whole lot of legal protections for whistleblowers today. And you should keep that in mind with any decisions you make. I guess I should clarify, and I do this on the Hangout, is that I'm not a lawyer. I don't have legal training, and I'm not trying to give you legal advice. If you find yourself in a situation where you think whistleblowing might be necessary, find a lawyer, contact a lawyer. It's one of the first things you do. The lawyer will tell you what you are required to do by the law, what ethics. The lawyer can help you with the ethical challenges also. But if you're ever in a situation where you're not sure about what you should do, get in contact with a lawyer. If you are with a professional society like an engineering society, usually the engineering society will have lawyers that they can give you that are trained to deal with those professional issues. So contact your professional society, contact the professional ethics committee to get specific legal advice for your situation. I talk about some more common sense procedures in the lecture video. The only thing I haven't really talked about that's on this lesson are the deontology. Deontology just means duty theory. It means theories focused on obligation. I think I'm not, the secret word here is for the lecture, secret word, not for the Hangout. I think I'm going to leave the discussion of deontology until next week, next week's Hangout. And I'll go ahead and stop what I want to talk about this week. If anyone has any other questions or thoughts that they'd like to add.
Wait, so just to be clear, so Nuremberg is the Hangout code and duty is the lecture code. Okay.
sorry, I was muted. That's right. Deontology is the, duty is the lecture word, and Nuremberg is the Hangout word. Remember, those Hangout words are extra credit, so you can't lose points by not doing them. You can only gain points by doing them. So it can't eat into your grade. I hope this was helpful. I hope this gets you into the lesson material for this week. Talk about whistleblowing. I'm interested to see your thoughts. If you have other questions, send me an email or let me know. All right, I'm done. That's it.
Okay.
See you next week, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, everyone.